In this video, I will show you how to automate data ingestion from database to BigQuery using Google Cloud's application integration IPaaS solution. Whether you need to move large dataset or set up recurring job, application integration makes it very simple, efficient, and scalable. Imagine you have a Cloud SQL database with thousands or even millions of records, and you need to transfer this data to BigQuery for analytics. Now the process can be complex, especially if you're dealing with large tables and want to optimize for performance, but with application integration, you can recursively fetch records from Cloud SQL using pagination, and then write this data in parallel to BigQuery for faster processing, and run the workflow on demand or on schedule. So let's break this down step by step. In this scenario, what is going to happen? Application integration is going to sit in the middle. Application integration is going to provide you connectors to your database, and it is going to provide you connectors to BigQuery. Now what will happen with this connectors is, you do not have to worry about any JDBC connections which you need to make to database, or how you are going to connect to BigQuery. The authentication and all these details will be taken care by the connector sitting here. How can you trigger this? So if based on your use case, you can create different mechanisms to trigger your process. You can have API triggers. You can have a schedule trigger for your batch to execute. These triggers are going to make execution of your job very easy, and then application integration is going to take care of fetching the data and sending it to BigQuery. Within application integration, it provides you a mechanism of pagination, and this pagination is what we are going to use in our demo today. And we will set it up end to end, step by step, without skipping any step, so that you can follow along and work on your sample if you want to do it. So let's get to it. Now, to start with, what we need is a database, and then for this example, I have chosen MySQL, that is Cloud SQL instance of MySQL provided by Google Cloud, and I have created a table called as contacts, and you can use a very easy DDL definition to create your table. And then in my table, I have created 6 columns. One is name, last name, phone, Salesforce ID, insert timestamp, and a primary key. And I have about 1024 records. So if I select this, I have 1024 record, and if I do select star from my table, I will see the records, the sample of records which I want to write and fetch and write to my BigQuery, which is good, which is fine. So you will have this starting point for your database itself. Now the next thing we need is a dataset in BigQuery. So that is what I'm going to create next. I'm going to go here, click on create dataset, and I'm going to name it MySQL DB dump demo dataset. Going to make it regional. Select any region you want. I'm going to go with Europe West 2 in London, and then just create this dataset. And within this dataset, I'm going to create a table. Right now there is no table existing, it is empty dataset. So let's create a table, and this table is going to mimic the fields which we have in our database itself. So let's call it tab and add fields. So I think I had P key, so let's name it P key, and it doesn't have to be exactly same as your database itself. You can name it anything. So let's, for the sake of this demo, let's call it primary key. Then I think I had name, then I have last name, then I had phone, and it doesn't have to have all the values also, you can have some extra values also, but you get the idea. So Salesforce ID, and then insert timestamp DB. Let's call it DB insert timestamp. And then let's make it timestamp here and leave everything else as string, and we create the table. Now, if you go to table, we don't have any values, it's empty. Now this is the table we want to fill with the database values which we have here, and for that we are going to use application integration. So let's switch to application integration and set this whole process up. We need to set up some connectors which we are going to use in our integration. To do that, we can go to a hamburger menu again, click on integration connectors, and click on this connections, and we are going to create a new connection, and we are going to name it and create it into Europe, if I can find. So just for the sake of it, I'm going to select a different region, because this region and your BigQuery or table doesn't have to be in the same region. You can choose different. So let's select BigQuery first, and then we will create a connection for database. Let's name it MySQL dump demo connection, and the project ID is I need to change it to hyphens, not underscores, and then the project ID is this project, and I'm going to copy my project ID, give this. So in this case, I have already done it in past, but if you have not, then you have to give access to this service account to access your BigQuery table. And if it is, this table is in different project, if you're using BigQuery in different project, it is going to ask you to give this service account access. And if it's a different one or somebody else's project, you give them this service account ID, and they can add and give this role like BigQuery job user role or read session user role, and then you will be able to access it. Now let's go and copy the dataset name. Let's copy this and go back. We just have to give MySQL, and then it already has access. Now next, authentication is no problem because we have already provided service account, so it will use workload identity to give that. Now we click on create, and we wait for this dataset or the connection or the connector to be ready, and then we can utilize it. Now for MySQL database connection also, it is the same process. What I have done here is I gave a connection name, I gave the project ID, I selected the region, I had given my instance ID, and this instance ID you can get from your database instance itself. If I go back here, I have my SQL instance. Within that, when you have created, you will get the instance information. All this information is available here. This is what you have to provide, and then the database table name, database name you have provided. So this is the database name, and then you just go through and create the ID and password for your database user, and then you just save, and with that you will have a database connector also created. So now let's go to application integration and create an integration to make this whole process work. Still remember, we are doing this, that we have a database connection, database in our case that is MySQL, and in BigQuery we have a data set where we want to write to a table. So this is what we are going to do. Now let's create that. I'm going to click on create integration, give this an integration a name. How does this work? Now let's understand what is going to happen in this integration, and how does application integration gives you all the capabilities of fetching information. When dealing with large databases, fetching all the records at once is resource intensive. it can overwhelm memory, slow down performance, and lead to timeouts. Now, pagination solves this by fetching the data in chunks or pages. But to do this effectively, the system needs to keep track of where it left off after each batch. And that's where cursors come in. A cursor is like a bookmark for your data fetch operation. It keeps track of your current position in the dataset. For example, if you're fetching thousands of rows at a time, a cursor will remember the last row fetched so that the next query can start right where the previous one ended. And that is the concept which application integration also uses, and that is what it provides you as variables which you can use to orchestrate your process, where every time you fetch some records, for example, if we fetch these records, and then application integration will give you that based on your query, you were supposed to get all these many records, but it is only going to fetch some set of it, and that is what is called as a page. And this page is going to give you how many total records are there, what is the current page token, and what is the next page token. Now what you can do is, if you are able to orchestrate this next page token on the next query when you fire to your database, it is going to fetch the next set of record. And every time we do that, we have to take this next page token, send it back to our previous process, and that process can set when the next batch of query is fired, use this next page token as current page token, and then fetch the next set of records. And we have to keep doing it till all the records are fetched and exhausted. And this is the process we are going to go and use in our application integration setup to fetch all the records. So let's get started and implement this whole logic of fetching data and sending it to BigQuery dataset itself. So I will go to my integration which we created, MySQL data demo, and let's get started from the first step itself. So the first step which I want to do, I want to create a trigger, and this trigger is essentially going to go to my SQL and fetch some data. So I'm going to call it my SQL private trigger. I'm going to rename this and say my SQL private trigger, and then I'm going to drop a connector, and here I have all these connectors which were recently used, or you can just go here and search for connector, click here, drag it down here, and connect these two. Now let's go and rename this. This is my SQL connector. Let me just zoom in a little bit more so that it's a little bigger. Now let's configure this connector to do some task. This time we are going to Europe West 4, and I'm going to select my SQL connector connection which we created in previous step. Click on entities, and you have entities and action. You can select what you want to do. On the entities, we are going to go to contacts table, and on the contacts table we want to fetch the data from this. So there are different operations you can do. You can do get, list, create, update, and delete. So this time I'm going to select list. And one thing I want you to keep an eye on is the moment I do next and done, there will be some new variables created, and these are the variables which we are going to use to fetch data out of the MySQL database itself. So just as a quick intro, so we have list entities page token, list page size. All these new variables are created by the connector, which we can utilize to fetch everything in recursive order. But for now, I'm going to just test this, and let's do one publish in this state. And this is the one basic. This is not yet ready for fetching everything, but you will see what I mean by that. And let's do enable editing. I should have tested it, but yeah, let's do this and click on test integration and see what happens with this. Now if I go to view logs, within view logs I will be able to see what happened when my integration got triggered, and this time you will see that my connection was success and I am able to fetch some data from my database. But this time, because I had almost 1000 records in my database itself. If I go back here, go to my Cloud Studio and file this query, you will see I have around 1024 records, but my log is showing it only some portion of that log or data is fetched. Now what happened here? If I go back in my SQL connector, there are some configurations which are set by default. For example, the list entity space size or list entity space token. So the token, first time when it's run, there is no page token setup. So it is going to fetch the first initial page only. And the page size by default is set to 50. But if I set it to 1, we will again run and see what happens with 1. But before that, I want to show you that it is also going to set some list entities next page token for us to iterate over and fetch the next page and the next page and the next page, which we have not yet utilized, but we will set a mechanism to fetch those information. So with the change of one page, if I test it again, this time instead of fetching all the 50 records, my integration is very quickly going to go and fetch only one record. So this is the page size which configuration which you have, where you can control how many records you want to fetch in one single page of your execution. So let's go back there and change this page size back to 50. You can also make it a configurable variable so that you are not hard coding it, but that's for later. But now what we want to do, we want to iterate over and utilize these configuration which are exposed by the connector itself, and then recursively go and continuously fetch our information from the database and continue to fetch it till we have found all the records. So that's the next step. Now for the next step, what I'm going to do, first thing I'm going to set up an outside loop, which will be more like an API trigger right now, but you can also have a scheduler. One thing to note is that I have a private trigger for my internal inner loop, which you can create an externally exposable API trigger, but I have chosen to do a private trigger, but you are free to choose whichever you want. Now with this API trigger, let's give it a name, and I'm going to call it main controller. And within this main controller, I'm going to drop a while loop. And why while loop? Because I want to continuously keep going till I find and with a condition and then fetch it out. So I will connect this. Now in this while loop, what I want to do is I want to call my inner loop, which I have created as a separate sub integration. So I am selecting the integration name. This is the name of my integration itself. You can see here. And then I'm going to select the trigger name, which is my SQL private trigger. So in case if you're not able to see this private trigger, what you have to do, you have to first publish it. So you can publish it in your first phase itself, as I did. Once you publish it, then it becomes visible here, and then you will be able to select this. So just in case if you're not able to see, just remove all these things and then publish it once, and then go ahead and create your main controller while loop, and you will be able to see this. Now within the while loop itself, I need some conditions to set, and those conditions will be based on whether I have a next page token and all those things which we need to set. But before we go and set this while loop condition, let's set some variable which we need information to pass between inner loop and outer loop. As I said, the inner loop is exposing some entity space token and some next page token, and we want this next page token to go outside and then become the main token when the next page is executing. To do this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create some variables which will be used to hold the value or information which we are getting. So let's create one next page token variable. And this is the variable where I will be holding as a placeholder some information, and then I will select variable type as none, type string, and create this. And then I need another variable which will be used as an input to my inner loop, and that variable I am going to call as, and this time my variable type will be input and output to integration, because I want to make it as an input to my inner one and also want to set it as an output when my inner loop finishes the first batch and then it goes to next batch. I want to send this information back to my outer loop, hence it is an input and output of integration. Click on create. Now we have created two variables. Before we start utilizing it, I always recommend that do a publish, because you have created new variable. Just do a clean publish, and I'm getting an error because I need to set some information. So let's for now add a dummy information, or let's add some proper one. So we will say when next page token is not equal to empty, then execute it. So let's see if this satisfies all the errors, and we are able to publish. And before you start using things, I always recommend that do a refresh so that the tokens which have been created on your browser IDE, which we are using to configure application integration, can get all the cached value cleared, and information which you have created are available on your configuration setup. So when I go back to while loop, so I need to do one change to my condition which we have. That is that I also want to check in my loop condition that either when it is empty or when my current iteration, that the first iteration is equal to 0, then also execute it. So I want to execute it because at first time there will be no page token, but even if it is empty, still execute it if it's my first iteration. Now another thing which I want to do, that on each execution I want to map my variables to the variable which I am getting out of the next page token which I am getting internally. So let's create that. On the each execution from my outer loop, I want to set next page token to my next page subtoken, and when the integration finishes, I want to do the opposite of it. To explain this, what I am doing is, when my loop execute first time, my next page token will be empty, but it will be sent as an empty token to my inner integration, and whenever that integration finishes, the next page token of my connector will be set back to next page token and sent back to my outer loop, and then I will be able to utilize this. So the setup of this is complete. Now what we have to do, we have to go to our inner loop and start using this next page token which we are sending. To do this, I'm going to remove this connection here and use a data mapper. This data mapper I'm going to place in between my SQL connector and my trigger itself. Now in this data mapper, what I'm doing is, I'm going to take this next page sub integration input which I am sending and set it to list entities page token, the input to my connector which I have. So the input to my connector, the task input, which is the list entity space token. If it is empty first time, it will be empty. Next time when we iterate over it, it will be the next output which we have, that next entity page token. Now having said that, what we also have to do, that list entities next page token should be set back to the output so that it can go back and main controller can utilize it. So what we need is another data mapper, and this data mapper is essentially going to do the opposite of it. List entities next page token to the next page token sub integration output which we want. Now the thing which is remaining is to connect them. So I'm going to map this, and just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to say map input token to next page token, and for this it will be the other way around, map next page token to output. And let's connect this and this here. So with this, our configuration is almost complete. So we have already set this list entity space token, and then we have utilized the output of our connector, which is list entities next page token, and we are sending it back to the outer controller. So now let's do a publish and say, and this is what you will also notice that there is a Gemini running behind and giving you documentation suggestions. So let's just utilize that. And once we publish it, let's test it and see what happens with this new configuration which we have. Now this time, I'm not triggering my inner loop. I'm going to go to my outer controller and execute my integration. So I'm going to click on main controller and leave this next page token sub integration as empty, because this is what our outer controller is going to set. Click on test integration. And this time, let's go and see what happened. Now, when our integration ran, it went into while loop. Within the while loop, you can see all the 1024 records divided by 50 are almost 21 iteration. And within that each iteration, my SQL connector went and fetched all our records, like 50 records, and then it went to the next 50, next 50, next 50, next 50. So this is how we are able to control the fetching of all the pages of records. Now one thing which is remaining is, now we need to write it to our BigQuery database itself. So that's the next step we are going to do. As the third step, or the final step, is that once we collect all this information, we want to write it to our BigQuery dataset itself. Now one thing what I want to do is, connector of MySQL is fetching the data in a JSON array, which you might have seen. I want to collect it in a normal array. So let's say I'm going to give it name of SQL data output array, and I'm going to select the variable type as none, because that's fine. We just want to utilize it, and the type is JSON. I'm going to leave it empty, and I'm going to run it once and see what happens with this, and if my variable is properly filled or not. Before that, I forgot that I need to map it. I'm going to open this data mapper. In my data mapper, I'm going to take this SQL data output array and fill it with the output array of my SQL connector, the payload which is coming, the connector output payload. Now I have added this connector output payload to my SQL data array. I'm going to go back and then publish it and then test it once. So let's click on main controller, execute this. And within this, if I go to my SQL data iteration, in the map, you will see my SQL data array is filled with the data of my output. So I'm just going to make a quick copy of this and I will show you why I'm doing that. And within that, you will see my output was there of SQL connector output, which I have filled into my SQL data output array. Now we are going to utilize this output array to iterate over and write to BigQuery. So I'm going to skip this. And I'm going to create another private trigger for my BigQuery implementation. So let's call this as write to BQ private trigger. And what we want an JSON input which should come to my BigQuery so that I can take the JSON input and write it. So let's create a variable and we are going to call it SQL data input, and variable type will be input to integration. We do not have to set it as output, it's just an input. And this time I'm going to select JSON as type and put the copy of my JSON value which I'm expecting, so that a sample or example is created. I'm just going to give an empty default value and click on create. Now what happened, because I gave my phone number, sales ID, the sample of my JSON, it created the type, the schema, and so that it is application integration is able to infer these values and you are able to utilize them. And also going to change the trigger ID, and then I'm going to drop a connector, and let's change the name of the connector to write to BQ connector, and let's configure this. And this time I'm going to go to Europe West 4, which is where we created our connector in the initial phase, and then going to select the connection. So my connection was MySQL dump demo con. Select that, click on next, select entities, click next, select the table in my dataset. And this time, instead of doing a list as we did in our database connector, I'm going to select create and click next and then do done. This is all right. I'm going to connect these two. Now what is happening here is that this trigger is set up to receive an object of data, and this object of data is going to be written to BigQuery itself. And I want to use this trigger iteratively in parallel for every element of the object which we have collected, that is the SQL data output array which we created, and we are going to recursively call it in parallel and write it to this. So that is what we are going to set now. But before that, as usual, I need to publish it to use this trigger. I did that. Click on enable editing, go back here. Just for safe measures, I'm going to do a refresh. On my inner loop, I'm going to drop a for each parallel. Select this, connect this to my previous step. And in my for each parallel, I'm going to select an array, and my array is SQL data output array. And my sub integration, which I want to call, is write to BQ private trigger, and I'm going to make it async because it is okay to write it in parallel asynchronously, and I don't want to wait for every execution response to come back. You can, and you can do some exception handling if you want to. Another thing which I want to do is when I'm iterating over the array itself, I want to map every element of that array one by one to SQL data input, and this is the SQL data input which we are going to get in our sub integration, and that is what we are going to use and write to BigQuery itself. So that we have set up. Now let's go back here. Because we are getting a variable with our input data, I'm going to drop a mapper. Now this data mapper is essentially going to map input which we are getting. The input is SQL data input, and we need to map it to write to BigQuery payload itself. Now you will notice that I have some different element IDs. That primary key is different name, phone, and all those things are differently named. So this is where the data mapper comes handy. If this object were exactly same, I could have dropped SQL data input directly into connector input payload. But since they are different, I can do is one by one map. And this time it's complaining that primary key in our input data is a double, but in our expected object it's a string. So what we can do out of the box functions which application integration is providing. We do that, it will convert it to string, and then we continue on to do timestamp, and then we do last name, and finally its name. Once we have done the mapping, let's connect these tasks together. Our parallel loop is going to recursively parallelly call our private trigger to write to BQ, and then data mapping will happen and it will write to BigQuery. Now let's publish and test it. I'm going to trigger it by a main controller. Click on this and test integration. And while it is running, it's starting to fetch data. And let's go to BigQuery and see if data is starting to flow. Earlier we were getting no data here. So if I run this, now the data is starting to flow. So far we have 105 record. Now we have 597 record. If I keep running it, it will reach 699, so on and so forth. So that is what is happening, that our integration is running. The main controller is controlling the page location and what next page to fetch. The inner loop is fetching that data, and then it's parallelly calling our write to BigQuery. And if I go to logs, that's the same thing we can identify in our logs itself, and we can see the file loop and then iteration. Within those iteration we have parallel processes running, and then each data is sent and parallelly written to BigQuery. So with this, we are able to implement the whole orchestration and writing recursively and fetching data from database and writing to BigQuery using application integration. And that's all for the demo and hands-on. Thank you.